Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us again. I'm very happy to welcome Dr. Ruth Grossman. Ruth is a professor and chair of communication sciences and disorders at Emerson College in Boston and the head of the FACE Lab. And I'd like to talk to Ruth about her exciting work about emotional expression in people with autism and how we actually characterize emotions and expressions using technology or technological means, and why is it really of interest to us when we think back at taking it to the clinical field. Hi, Ruth. Thanks for joining us.
Hi, Ofer. Thanks for having me.
Oh, it's a pleasure. And I started by making lots of promises, but maybe you should tell us a bit more or briefly about what kind of work do you do in your lab?
We look at various aspects of social interactions, so face-to-face communication in adolescents with autism, and specifically adolescents who have language and cognitive skills that are within the normal range. So, 1 or 2 standard deviations above or below the mean. So these are adolescents who are fully verbal. They're typically in a general education classroom. They have a lot of educational and career potential. And as you know, they very often fall short of realizing that potential for a number of reasons relating to how they're integrating into their social environment. So we're very interested in looking at all of their nonverbal expressions that are, and as they relate to communication. So looking at facial expressions, looking at tone of voice, looking at reciprocity during a conversation. And we use a number of different technologies to do that. We use eye tracking, both a standalone eye tracker that sort of just sits on the table in front of you and records what you're looking at, as well as eye tracking glasses that are mobile and can record wherever you're looking in your environment. We use infrared motion capture to look at the movement of facial features in various different situations, acoustic analyses, a lot of video recordings and video editing and video coding to try and make sense of what these expressions are and the impact that they're having on conversation partners.
And when I think about, that's a lot. and you're mentioning coding, and I was wondering if coding actually means human coding.
Yeah. So we do a lot of human, sort of an interesting combination of things, right? The motion capture is designed to be an objective measure of facial feature movement, right? It's 6 infrared cameras recording the movements of 32 reflective markers that we strategically place on somebody's face in XYZ coordinates at 100 frames per second. It's a truckload of really objective, fine-grained facial movement data that we can objectively analyze to say, well, what actually is happening in the movements of all of the different components of the face and how do they relate to each other? And, we can look at velocity and distances between markers and all of that stuff. But in the long run, what we care about is what does all this look like to a human being who you're potentially having a conversation with, right? So the counterpoint to that objective measure is a human being sitting at a computer screen looking at a video and doing frame by frame coding of facial behaviors. And that could be fine grain coding, like when did the eyebrows start going up? When did they start coming down? But it's focused on features and expressions that a human being can perceive and code, in contrast to the machine stuff. Or it can be coding about really your own perceptions, right? Did this look natural? Did it look awkward? Did it look like the person was having a good time as part of this conversation? Did they seem engaged in the conversation, right?
So more global expressions.
Right.
Sorry, more global impressions.
Global impressions of global expressions. Yeah.
Expressions.
Yeah. So it's really running the gamut.
Even when you ask for a coder to sit and watch frame by frame, it still kind of differs from what we usually do in everyday life when we interpret another person's mental state or emotions, right?
Absolutely.
And so this additional layer of having a technology and coders working with individual frames, and eventually or ultimately somebody who's actually telling you what impression they've had of it. This building allows you maybe to get closer to the actual field.
Yeah, I mean, I think what I'm trying to do is to really probe a human being's perception of somebody's expressions, that person as part of a conversational dyad, right? The conversation itself. So really that human perception that is at the end what we're hoping to improve, right? Like, because if your perception is that this is a lovely person to talk to and the conversation is going great, then that's a person you're going to want to have another conversation with, right? If on the other hand, your perception is I don't understand what this person is trying to signal to me, right? I'm confused, I'm feeling uncomfortable, I'm feeling awkward, you're less likely to want to have another conversation with that person. And then use the technology, both the coding, which is very human driven, like the fine grain coding, and the motion capture to drill down into, all right, what exactly is causing these what is driving these human perceptions? And is it different in different contexts? And can that start giving us a clue about how we can better support social integration and effective social interactions between these groups?
This impression is often cross-model in nature. So we've got, yes, we're combining, we're integrating what we see from facial expressions, what we see in the body language, what we hear in the way people talk, and of course what they're actually saying. And can you actually try and integrate this using your different groovy machines?
Yes. And we actually just last year published a paper that is basically the paper I've been wanting to write for about 7 or 8 years now. And it has taken a lot of work with the individual technologies to just figure out how to use it in this context, how to ask the right questions, how to develop the algorithms that can help analyze a lot of these data, right? And we sort of started out with isolated posed smiles, and then we worked to more than one type of facial expression, but still posed. Then we went to natural reactions, facial expressions to, watching videos. And then we went to conversations or added language to it. And each time we've been progressing, and this is a lot with the support and hard work of collaborators of mine at University of Southern California, Sri Narayanan's lab, the SAIL lab, but they've really done a lot of this technological heavy lifting of trying to figure out how can we scale up our understanding of the technology to support the research questions that we want to ask. And last year, we published a paper that is taking the motion capture analysis, acoustic analyses, eye tracking analyses as part of somebody's expression, and trying to understand each of those channels separately, as well as the interrelatedness between all of them, to say, where are things going awry? Right? Is it an individual channel, or is it in the synchrony between those channels that we start getting these impressions of something's not quite the way that I would expect it, or that I can interpret it as part of a social interaction?
And what was the conclusion?
What we found is that it's in that interaction. And this is, again, my premise, when I started this work, I don't know, 7, 8 years ago, feels like 100 years, was that there is an asynchrony between these modalities in individuals with autism that is different from what you find in neurotypical individuals. And that is actually what we found, is that the auditory, the spoken channel and the facial expression channels are not as synchronized and predictive of each other in autistic individuals as they are in neurotypical individuals. And that is specifically true, actually coming back to sort of the broader framework of this conversation, that is specifically true when there's an emotional component to it. So when the sentences that were spoken were neutral, there was not a lot of difference in the synchrony between these two groups. But when there was an emotional component, the two of how much predictive synchrony there was between these channels started to diverge. So there seems to be something about the more expressive, the more emotive somebody with autism becomes, the more the synchrony between these channels does not quite line up. And that can lead to some of these less favorable impressions that we've been recording.
But you're actually adding another component now, which is not just about the expression, but also about the experience. So if I experience a high level of emotion, of course, it will affect my expression, but is that something that you actually took into account? Were there any sensors or measures of their emotional arousal level?
We've done some biophysiology work as well. I have to tell you that that's a technology that I'm currently not pursuing further. I'm not that convinced about what that kind of technology can tell us about the actual underlying communicative intent of somebody in a way that I would find meaningful from my work.
But that would be more methodological, right? You're saying we can't really measure it properly now. But
yes.
Theoretically, do you see that actually playing emotional regulation playing a role in there? Because you said,
sure.
When it's neutral, it's not really coming across as odd.
Yeah, that's a really, really tricky question, right? And it's actually really, speaking of methodology, it's really hard to measure, right? Because there aren't any measurements that I can do objectively that tell me what your true emotional state was relative to what your emotional expression was.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm really talking about the expression and how well does that expression translate to somebody else, right? How well is it perceived and interpreted by somebody else? I really cannot speak in my work at this point. I cannot speak to what your actual emotional state was when you made that facial expression, right? And if there's a disconnect there, that's a whole other question. And the only way I know to really answer that is to ask people, but then you've got them thinking about it, and that changes everything about the as well, right? So then you're in that whole meta spiral that I don't know how to get out of methodologically speaking to try to answer that question.
I'm asking this because when you think about trying to take it back to teaching people to express themselves, to bridge this gap, to make themselves appear or integrate more smoothly socially, you'd have to actually address not only what they're expressing, but also how it connects to what they're feeling. And then that becomes tricky because, again, when you said, I'm actually making them think about it, and then they're less natural. They are more planned or programmed, and then it feels or awkward for another reason.
Right. Yeah. And look, when I first got into this work and I first started looking at the motion capture stuff, I was very much approaching this from a remediation perspective, right? If I can identify where the facial features move differently in somebody with autism, then maybe I can teach them, right, how to move their faces differently in order to be better understood. It was a long, naive time ago. And very much not representative of a number of truths. One of them being that that's just not feasible, right? From anybody who's ever tried to get somebody to smile naturally for the camera knows that there is no good way to tell somebody how to do that, right? I mean, it either looks right or it doesn't. And we don't have a good cue to say, okay, if you move the left mouth corner a little bit further out, right? Like that's not the way we think about that as a human perceiver, right? It's like, this looks right or it doesn't. And we really don't break it down further than that. The other piece is that it's really not about trying to teach somebody with autism to move their faces in a way that is unnatural to them, right? So I really think where I hope my work can go is towards awareness raising and education of all stakeholders of those conversations and interactions, right? Is to say,
not necessarily the person with autism, but the other party.
Yes. So you as an autistic person need to be aware that your facial expressions are not as clearly read, right? That the other person may not know what you're really feeling. So you might need to say it, right? You might need to be explicit about it. You as a person interacting with somebody who's autistic, whether that's a neurotypical person or somebody else, need to be aware that what you're perceiving may not be an actual representation of that person's internal state or communicative intent, right? So you may need to ask a few more questions, or you may need to sort of stop yourself from giving into that first impression instinct of maybe even wanting to extricate yourself from that conversation because it's feeling awkward, right? And like hang in there a little bit longer, give it a chance, develop and try to understand better what the message is that this person is trying to send you, within a greater understanding of some of these ambiguities and inconsistencies that come up in the facial and voice expressions of people with autism. That's
interesting. Because you reminded me of a young man that I've recently met who said, I went on so many dates, and he's a good-looking guy, and he's very smart, and he's got a good profession. What every mother would be happy to have him as a date for her daughter, I hope. But he says, I never managed to get a second date, and when I look at him, it's pretty clear he doesn't move his face, so he looks very flat. Well, I think it's clear. I'm not sure if that's what the other person's feeling when they're on a date with him. But then what kind of feedback, if you were mapping this person's interaction with another person, what kind of feedback would you be able to give him? Would it just be, listen, face it, you've got, your face is flat and you just have to state it when you start a date? Or is there a way to help him kind of change the way he expresses himself?
I think that very much depends on him, right? And what he wants to do in this world, right? And it's look, it's really tricky, right? Because I could go in there and say, look, your face is flat, you're going to have to just state it, but that may not be a level of self-disclosure that he's comfortable with, right? Or that may not be the way he wants to pursue a relationship. So I do think there's a conversation we had to say, look, here's what I'm seeing about your facial expression. Here's what I'm understanding based on the literature that's out there, right? And my clinical observations, assuming you came to me for advice, right? Assuming you came to me to ask this question, like, why do I never get a second date, right? Based on this research, based on the literature, based on my clinical assessment, I can tell you that it is likely that your facial expressions, your nonverbal signals are not being perceived in the way that you probably intend them, right? That there is a perception going on the other side that is different from what you have in mind. Now, we can talk about this in a number of different ways. I can maybe help you raise your own awareness of that, through video recordings and
people sitting in front of the mirror and actually practicing.
Right. If that is a route that you want to go, right? Do you want to be more, do you want to try to be more animated or differently animated than that? Mm-hmm. Or do you want to go a self-disclosure route? Or do you want to say, you know what, this is who I am, and the person who will want me will be the right person.
Would need to want me this way.
Right.
I'm just thinking about the people who actually do this and often end up looking very creepy.
That was exactly where I was going to go next. I think we have to be very careful. First of all, it is not true as a group, right? And I'm not speaking for any individual person with autism. Sure. But as a group, it is not true, based on the literature and some of my own work as well, that autistic people are generally more flat as right? Actually, what we've been finding is that in a lot of situations, more expressive, right? And more interactive, and more isn't necessarily working out as better for them. And so that's the careful piece, right? Can we work with this person who you just, that random example, right? Can we work with that person to be more animated? Sure. Is that going to help him in the long run? I don't know. Depends on what his facial expressions then look like, and whether they then create a better first impression, among their conversation partners or not. May not be true.
No, but then the question is, can we actually, because I have come across different attempts to teach people with autism to express emotions, and in many cases they end up looking like a caricature when they try to do that. But if we can try and help, for those who are interested in it, help them tone it down a notch, can your machines actually spot that difference and be able to represent that fine tuning that may be required?
I don't think that's the best use of this particular technology. And I'm saying that because it actually takes an extensive amount of post-processing to get something meaningful out of these data, and an aggregation of data across samples and across individuals. So I don't see it as a valuable biofeedback tool, if you for any individual person as part of intervention. I think it's more, it is solidly a research tool that can help us identify the kinds of things that would be worth working on with somebody, but I don't see it as an individual intervention tool for a person to say, like, am I getting closer to
where I want to go?
Maybe.
Okay, that's my personal fantasy is where we want to go. One thing that actually got me curious was, why did you, especially if you work on voices, why did you necessarily go for adolescents?
Because their voices are breaking. Is that what you're? Yeah. So so my love really is with the faces, not as much with the voices. But I definitely see your point. But adolescence is that time in life where all of these social cues are refined, and where the perception of them becomes so much more important and so much more sensitive, where you really trying to lay that foundation for who you are out there in the world in interactions with others. So it just struck me as the perfect time to try and understand what's going on, right? Like 8-year-olds don't care as much about what others think of them.
Think of them.
Way that a 13, 14-year-old cares, right? So since my work is both measuring the expressions themselves, but also getting a listener perception and a viewer's perception of those expressions, it just made sense to me to work with adolescents who will tell you, like, that person's awkward. I don't think so, right? 5-year-old's not going to do that for you. Is that, fine. He seems fine. I'm going to go play with my stuff over there. And as long as he doesn't touch my toys, we're good. But that's a very different level of sophistication of social interaction. And so adolescence is really where that sophistication level and the high stakes, right, of getting all these nuances right comes into play. That's why I work with adolescents.
And what's the role of puberty in your eyes?
We ignore it, No, just I mean, my ideal age range is like 13 to 17, 18. So we're very often, sort of on the other side of at least some of the big changes in puberty. The acoustic analyses, obviously, particularly if you're looking at pitch levels and pitch ranges, you have to account for that. On the facial expressions side, not as much. There's some data out there suggesting that you really have adult level sophistication for facial expressions, by the age of 10 or so. So the age ranges that I'm looking at are safely on the other side of that developmental curve.
And what about gender differences? Not just, can you see a difference between adolescent males and females, but also in terms of who they're interacting with?
Yeah, that's a really, really important question, and one that I don't have answers for yet. I'm hoping to work on some data sets that will help me do that. You need a lot of data from girls with autism, and that's a little bit harder to come by, as I'm sure you're well aware of. That's the data sets that I have so far don't really allow for that analysis, but I'm hoping to break into that a little bit more with some of my upcoming work, because it is important, and we're assuming that both the expressions and the perception of those expressions are going to be significantly affected by your gender. Whether that's,
and again, in terms of your partner, because so the boys, okay, we're sticking just with boys or adolescent males. Does it matter if they interact with another guy or with a girl?
Right. And does it matter whether the person observing the interaction is male or female, right? And then, there is the sex of the people, and then there's the perceived gender of the people, right? So even if somebody was biologically
Exactly.
comes across as female, right? How does that affect somebody's perception of their expressions and their social?
And how does all this associate with what the computer actually analyzes eventually,
Right.
what the
Yes,
sensors pick
exactly.
up?
Yeah. Yeah. Stay tuned. Let's talk again in a couple of years and maybe I'll have some answers for you then.
Good. Okay, we'll do that. I'll take your word for it. Thank you so much for joining us and for telling us about your fascinating work. It was a pleasure. As
Always a
always.
pleasure to talk to you, Ofer.
Take care.
Take care. Bye.